In the darkest corners of history, where the shadows of human cruelty loom large, lies a story that is both familiar and profoundly unsettling. It is a story of a nation built on the backs of those who were denied the basic dignity of freedom. A story of the American South during the era of slavery. This is not just a tale of the oppressed and the oppressors, but a complex narrative of human resilience, economic exploitation, and the enduring struggle for justice and equality. It is a story that echoes through the ages, reminding us of the profound cost of human greed and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The southern United States in the 19th century was a land of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a region of breathtaking natural beauty, with vast plantations stretching as far as the eye could see, their fields lush with cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops. On the other hand, it was a place where the rule of law was a facade, and the lives of millions of human beings were reduced to mere commodities. The system of slavery, which had been a cornerstone of the Southern economy since the colonial era, reached its zenith in the antebellum period. This system was not just a form of labor. It was a brutal and dehumanizing institution that permeated every aspect of Southern society. At the heart of this system was the plantation, a microcosm of the broader Southern economy. The plantation was a self-contained world where the planter, the overseer, and the slaves each played a role in the intricate dance of production and control. The planter, often a wealthy landowner, was the ultimate authority, his word law. The overseer, typically a poor white man, was the enforcer, tasked with maintaining discipline and maximizing productivity. And the slaves, who were the lifeblood of the plantation, were the ones who bore the brunt of this system. They worked from dawn to dusk, toiling in the fields under the scorching sun, enduring physical and emotional abuse, and living in conditions that were often little more than squalid. The Southern economy was built on the backs of these slaves, and their labor was the foundation of the region's wealth. Cotton, in particular, was the golden crop that fueled the Southern economy. The demand for cotton in the industrializing North and in Europe was insatiable, and the Southern planters were more than happy to supply it. The more cotton they produced, the wealthier they became, and the more they invested in new land and more slaves. This cycle of exploitation and expansion created a system that was deeply entrenched and seemingly unbreakable. But the system of slavery was not without its cracks. One of the most significant factors that kept the system in place was the role of the poor whites. These were the men and women who, though not wealthy enough to own slaves themselves, found a place within the system as overseers, slave drivers, and members of the patrol system. The presence of poor whites was crucial because it created a buffer between the planters and the slaves, a human firewall that prevented the kind of large-scale slave revolts that had occurred in other parts of the world, such as the West Indies. The West Indies, with its smaller population of white overseers and a larger proportion of enslaved people, saw more frequent and violent revolt. In contrast, the Southern United States had a much larger white population, particularly in the form of poor whites, who were more numerous than the slaves. This demographic advantage allowed the planters to maintain a tight grip on the slave population. The poor whites, despite their own economic struggles, saw an opportunity to rise above their station by aligning themselves with the planters. They were given positions of authority, however minor, and a sense of belonging to the privileged class. This psychological and economic incentive was enough to keep them loyal to the system, even as they themselves were often exploited by the planters. The poor whites were not the only factor that kept the system stable. Another crucial element was the safety valve of slavery, which allowed some slaves to escape to freedom. This escape route, though fraught with danger, provided a glimmer of hope for those who dared to take the risk. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, was instrumental in helping fugitive slaves reach the North and Canada. The stories of escaped slaves, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, became powerful symbols of resistance and inspired countless others to seek freedom. Despite the efforts of the planters to tighten their grip on the slave population, the number of fugitive slaves continued to grow. The economic impact of these escapes was significant, as the loss of skilled laborers and the constant need to replace them put a strain on the plantations. The planters responded by lobbying for stricter fugitive slave laws, which made it more difficult for escaped slaves to find refuge. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in particular, was a draconian piece of legislation that required all citizens to assist in the capture of escaped slaves and imposed severe penalties on those who helped them. This law was a clear indication of the desperation of the planters to maintain control over their human property. The fugitive slaves also played a crucial role in the abolitionist movement. Their stories of escape and the brutal conditions they had endured became powerful tools for those advocating the end of slavery. Frederick Douglass, in his famous 4th of July oration in 1852, delivered a scathing critique of American democracy, exposing the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated freedom while denying it to millions of its citizens. Douglass's words, and those of other escaped slaves, helped to galvanize public opinion and build a broader coalition against slavery. The true significance of slavery in the United States, however, lies not just in its economic impact, but in its profound effect on the development of American democracy. The question of slavery was at the heart of the nation's founding documents, and continued to shape its political and social landscape well into the 19th century. The Constitution, with its infamous 3/5 compromise, was a clear indication of the deep divide between those who sought to protect the institution of slavery and those who believed in the principles of liberty and equality. The debate over slavery was not just a moral issue. It was also a political and economic one. The Southern states, with their economy heavily dependent on slave labor, were determined to preserve the system at all costs. The Northern states, on the other hand, were increasingly industrialized and less reliant on slave labor. This economic divergence created a growing tension between the two regions, a tension that ultimately led to the Civil War. The Civil War, which began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, was the most devastating conflict in American history. It was a war fought over the future of the nation, a war that pitted brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, was a turning point in the war. It declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were to be set free, effectively turning the conflict into a struggle for emancipation. The end of the Civil War marked the formal end of slavery in the United States, but the struggle for true equality was far from over. The Reconstruction era, which followed the war, was a period of both hope and disillusionment. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to former slaves, and gave them the right to vote. However, these gains were short-lived, as the rise of Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries effectively re-enslaved many African Americans through a system of economic and social oppression. The legacy of slavery continues to shape American society in profound ways. The economic disparities, racial tensions, and social inequalities that have persisted for generations are a direct result of the deep wounds inflicted by the institution of slavery. The struggle for civil rights, which gained momentum in the mid-20th century, was a continuation of the fight for freedom and equality that began with the first fugitive slaves. In the end, the story of slavery in the United States is a story of resilience and resistance. It is a story of the human spirit's capacity to endure and to fight for a better future. The legacy of those who suffered and those who fought for freedom is a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in America. In the shadows of the past, we find the light of hope. The struggle continues.